Today's webinar is entitled Trade Disputes, Steel, Bags, and Wine, How the U.S. Tariffs are Impacting Transatlantic Trade, and is brought to you by the European American Chamber of Commerce and our network of chapters across the United States and Europe. The EACC is where Europeans and Americans connect to do business. I'm Todd Schwartz, Executive Director of the Cincinnati chapter of the EACC, and I'll be your host today. Now, we have a good number of registrants for today's event from across the United States and Europe, so I'm sure we'll have a vibrant and transatlantic discussion. One quick disclaimer, please note all comments and opinions expressed by our speakers today are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the European American Chamber of Commerce or our members. Let me now hand you over to Christina Schlesinska. She is the Executive Director of the Florida chapter of the EACC, and she'll introduce our topic and our speakers.
Thank you, Todd. So I'm Christina Schlesinska. I'm the Executive Director of the Florida chapter of the EACC, organizer of today's program. This webinar, as Todd said, is a part of a series of cutting-edge insights and information which the EACC network is putting together for you to better navigate today's troubled global and transatlantic waters. As Todd mentioned, our program will discuss how the trade disputes between the EU and US are impacting transatlantic trade and how affected industries and companies are handling this. While the focus will be on trade into the US, we will also offer some insights into what local impact looks like with the example of Florida, an increasingly significant trade hub between Europe, the US, and Latin America. Before I introduce our speakers, a reminder that the EACC is a connector and a platform for Europeans and Americans to meet, learn from one another, and do business. After this program, we will send you a list of attendees. And if you're interested in being connected to anyone, please reach out to me or to your local EACC chapter. This, of course, is a member-only benefit. And now, on to our stellar panel. Francisco Garzón is the Trade Commissioner for the Trade Commission of Spain in Miami since September 2019. Before that, he was CEO of ICEX, the Spanish Agency for Trade Promotion and Investment in Madrid. He also held positions as Trade Commissioner at the embassies of Spain in Brazil and Mexico. Peter Quinter is a shareholder and customs attorney in the Miami, Boca Raton, and Fort Lauderdale offices of the GRAYROBINSON law firm. He's the chair of the Customs and International Trade Law Group and also served as legal counsel at the Southeast Regional Headquarters of what is now known as U.S. Customs and Border Protection in Miami. Moving north, we have Lynn Osdan, who is Senior Vice President, Ethics and Compliance Corporate Affairs at LVMH Moet Hennessy Louis Vuitton in New York. Prior to this, Lynn was Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Secretary at Donna Karan International. We're delighted to have her on board. And finally, Laura Siegel Rabinowitz is a shareholder and customs attorney at GREENBERG TRAURIG in New York. She counsels business on complex supply chain and trade issues and has deep experience in handling all aspects of highly complex trade projects. Laura has spoken several times on EACC programs, and we're very happy to have her on board again, this time as moderator for our program today. And now, with no further ado, Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Christina, and welcome everyone. And I very much look forward to a lively discussion on the state of EU-US trade. It's really never been more timely. I don't remember another time when trade policy and business intersected quite so clearly. We have the governments intervening in M&A deals, with the French government asking LVMH to postpone their deal with Tiffany because of US trade policy. We have the US government asking a US company to take a stake in TikTok, a Chinese company, because of its trade policy. So with that as the background, our focus today will be on the intersection of trade policy, business, and specifically cross-Atlantic trade. So let's start with the long-running dispute over subsidies to Airbus and the US retaliatory tariffs. It's a long-running dispute. It's been before the WTO since 2004. And once the WTO made their findings in October of 2019, the US imposed additional tariffs on specific products from the EU. And this is on top of the general rate of duty, and on consumer products, that's quite onerous to begin with. So it's 25% on consumer products, and it started as 10% on aircraft, and in March of 2020, the US government raised the rate to 15% on aircraft. So the additional tariffs are on specific products from specific countries. It's cheese, fruit, meat, coffee, olives, Irish and Scotch whiskey, all the good things that the US companies import from the EU. In June of 2020, the USTR announced that it was considering revising this list and potentially increasing the tariffs to 100%. They issued a Federal Register notice and asked for comments, which many comments were in fact submitted. And then in August, the USTR announced their revised list. They decided to keep the tariffs at 25%, but in fact, their list was revised. So it's very important for US importers of EU products to review the lists. As I said, they're country specific and product specific. So Francisco, what would you say has been the impact of the US retaliatory tariffs for the Airbus subsidies, specifically on Spain, the EU in general? And if you could also speak to, has this the additional tariffs created somewhat of a competition among the EU states?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be joining this panel. And going right to your question, Laura, let me first give you some of a little bit of context info to tell our audience the importance of the trade between the EU and the US. The EU as a whole, and considering still with 2019 figures, the UK is the main trading partner of the US, roughly 20%, give or take, both of exports and imports, considering the EU as a whole. So we're talking about a very important partner, and this partnership is important both for the EU and for the US, I believe. So we're looking at roughly $450,000 million, almost $500 billion of imports from the EU into the US. So this is a very meaningful figure. If we look at the trade affected by the tariffs, by the retaliatory tariffs, one could think that it is not that important. We're talking that the bulk of the trade affected, we all know, is 7.5 million US dollars. Compared to the previous figure, one could believe it's not that much, roughly 1.5% of that. But it is important because tariffs affect trade, and they affect, they create trade diversion and trade destruction, and it is important for companies and for specific sectors. You mentioned some of the sectors that were affected. Roughly 40% of the trade volume affected goes to aircraft, but we're looking at 20% is wine, 10% is whiskey, roughly 5% is olive oil of the trade volume affected by these tariffs. So sector specific, it has a great importance, and it has affected trade flows between the US and the EU, and of course between the specific countries affected, Spain amongst them. In the case of Spain, the US is our main trading partner outside the European Union, so it is a very, very important market for us. It has affected specifically a number of agricultural products and wine, and we have seen an effect of these tariffs in trade flows over the past few months. To give you some insights, some data, if we look at the olive oil, and if we take the period from October last year, that was when the tariffs were imposed, to March this year, so that we don't look at data that is affected by the COVID, by the pandemic, and look at that period of time from October to March, US imports of olive oil from Spain dropped by 60%. So there was an important effect on trade, and specifically on Spanish exports to the U.S. And regarding your specific question about if this had an effect on other countries, or how the trade diversion had appeared within this framework. For instance, if we look at the figures from Portugal over that period of time, exports of olive oil from Portugal to the U.S. increased by more than 1,000%. So there you are. You could consider this an anecdote, but I wanted to highlight the effect with these two pieces of information, which I believe that show that the tariffs have an effect. They have an effect on trade flows, and more importantly, I believe they have an effect on companies and on consumers, which I believe is also very, very important.
Yeah, thank you so much, Francisco. Lynn, let's turn to you. Your company has over 75 brands, a diversity of products. What would you say has been the impact of the retaliatory tariffs?
Well, so we've been watching this very carefully for a long time, because when our products were on the original list, and as you know, it's been a dispute that's been going on for you said 14, I think it's 14 years, since 2004. I think we started these discussions on retaliation. It was only 14 years, now we're up to like 16 years. And we've been watching this because we're not part of the dispute at all. And so, having to be caught up into a dispute on airplane parts is obviously difficult. We have our products because we have wines from France that are on this list that are already tariffed, as well as Scotch, whiskey. And we also have, as you alluded to, and first of all, actually, I jumped right in, but I should have thanked you for inviting me to participate, and I thank the EACC for asking me to participate. So sorry for the jumping right in and forgetting sort of my manners. But we're also very much paying attention, because you just mentioned the most recent carousel that happened in August. And while we do have products, and it is very much affecting us, we have other products that are on the list, and the U.S. government right now, I forget the award, if it's being like 7.4 billion, but the U.S. government has really only used up about a third of its sort of firepower in this, of what it could actually tariff. So we have a great interest in watching what remains on that list, because others of our products remain on that list. Public information, it's cognac, it's champagne. So we are both watching what is already on the list and what could possibly become in the future when the U.S. government, when the carousel comes back into effect, which will be February of 2021.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is certainly evolving, and the U.S. Trade Representative has said that list will change, will be modified based on the actions of the EU. And that's
Yeah, because we all should know, we should all recognize that the Boeing, and this is why for people who are on this, but you have to really pay attention, because the Boeing the decision, the companion case, as they say, the Boeing case decision is likely to be coming out maybe the end of this month, around the 26th, 7th, something around there, which would then allow the EU to retaliate, and then we could be back into the cycle. There is speculation, though, that hopefully this will allow or create the platform for which a negotiated solution might be the outcome, which of course is something we've always been advocating for, which is, hoping for this to have negotiated solutions so that we are not caught up, and consumer products are not caught up in this dispute.
Right, and it really would become that's then a trade war.
I would articulate we're already in it, but it would actually I think it would escalate it clearly, and
So this is an important time because, I mean, these tariffs have been in effect since October of 2019. It doesn't seem that they're going away right away, certainly. 25% additional duty on consumer products on top of the general rate of duty is fairly onerous. So this is a good time for companies that are importing into the U.S. To review their classification of their merchandise. Every product that comes into the U.S. has a 10-digit harmonized tariff schedule provision attached to it. I worked recently with a French company that was importing fruit spread, and they had been classifying their merchandise as jam, which is on the retaliatory list, and they've been paying 25% additional duties since October. And then when we reviewed the classification, we realized that fruit spread comes under a different provision, which is not on the list. So now they qualify for refunds, and going forward, they're not paying the additional tariffs. So that's in terms of classification. And there are also, in terms of valuation, there are numerous legal methods to shrink the value of goods that are declared to U.S. Customs, and thereby reducing the duty liability. And then, of course, there's always the question of who, in fact, pays the tariffs. And it's a good time to look at the Incoterms in terms of who's responsible for paying the tariffs to U.S. Customs. So, Lynn, what can you tell us about what your brands are doing to mitigate the tariffs? Are your brands negotiating with suppliers and with customers to share the increased duty liability?
Well, I'd say that we're doing a lot of the things you mentioned, but certainly not negotiating with suppliers because we are our supplier. So in the tariffs that are already in place on Scotch whiskey, we own the supply chain. So, you know, it's really a left hand, right hand kind of situation because we are the supply chain. And unlike others, we cannot move Scotch whiskey into some other part of the world. It's only Scotch whiskey if it's made in Scotland. And the same, you know, with, although it's not on the list, the same would clearly be for champagne and cognac. What our brands have been doing, though, is taking very hard looks at what you were saying, classifications, other types of activities to make sure that they're properly, you know, that what can be done legally, and also are there other things that can be done to mitigate that. But in terms of passing along the costs, we're not able to go to our supplier to do that. But we are taking the other actions you mentioned.
Right. Well, I guess you're in an enviable position. Most U.S. importers are not as vertically integrated.
Well, we're vertically integrated in the products. We have a lot of vertical integration in many parts of our businesses. I've really specifically focused on the products that are currently on the list. And so those in particular, we're vertically integrated because we own the, you know, from the grapes to the, you know, to the end product. So, but yes, you know, everything that can be done because the margin, you know, it affects obviously the margins and all of the business, and there has been a drop in business. So in some of those product categories.
Right. So let's discuss now the new digital services tax. Numerous countries have either proposed or implemented the digital services tax, which is a tax on revenues for companies which are generated for providing certain digital services such as online advertising, online marketplaces, data services. The taxes to the users in those jurisdictions. In July of 2019, the French DST legislation was signed, and then the USTR announced that they would be imposing a 25% additional tariff on French goods. Then in March of 2020, the French and the US reached an agreement that there would be a delay in the French DST, which is at 3% until 2021. And then in May of 2020, the French announced that they would in fact be imposing the DST. Then in July of 2020, the USTR announced their retaliation plan and announced that there would be a 25% additional tariff on specific French products starting in January 21, and specifically makeup and handbags. Many other countries have adopted DST, such as Italy, India, and South Korea, and other countries are considering DST, including Spain, the UK, and Vietnam. So again, we're seeing the use of tariffs as a negotiating tool, first with Airbus, now with DST, and we haven't even discussed China yet. So Francisco, can you tell us what is Spain's reaction to the U.S. position and the threatened 25% additional tariff on certain French goods? And do you expect the DST and retaliatory tariffs to be expanded to other countries, including Spain?
Well, that remains to be seen. We're at the beginning of the process as far as Spain and other countries are concerned. But I mean, we have been looking at the process with France, and if we take that as an example, this certainly is a possibility. From Spanish perspective, what I can say is that to begin with, the Spanish DST is not in place yet. It's under parliamentary discussion. That would be my first comment. But as you said, we have received the notice from the U.S. Beginning the 301 procedure, and we are willing to discuss under bilateral consultations. But what, from our point of view, from our position, the Spanish DST has no discriminatory effect. It is no retroactive, and it does not have extraterritorial effect. So there shouldn't be any trouble and problem with it. And from our point of view, matters related with taxation in the global market and in the digital products are better addressed from an international cooperation perspective. And as you know, there are ongoing discussions in the OECD.
Great. Thanks. Lynn, can you comment on your company's view about the DST and what impact it potentially will have on you?
Well, right now, I mean, we have the list for France, which includes handbags and champagne. They have already named that. So we are facing this coming up. And we are watching very closely, but we're really, and this is something I wanted to make a point of, both going back to the EU, the Airbus Boeing discussion, and also DST. One of the things is that I recommend that you work and you look closely with various trade associations, because there are different associations, and you have to be in a way, because this is really, you have to look at which ones are specific to your, both to see what's specific to your goods and to see who's actually active. I think that one of the big takeaways is that, like, trade associations are wonderful, but they'll be responsive to their members. And if their membership is not pushing them on an issue, they'll not necessarily take it up. Some are natural to take it up, but otherwise they're not necessarily. So one of the things that I'm thinking about from an audience perspective or from the participant perspective is, if you have, very much watch what is on the lists, very much consider that, and then also think, how do you get your message heard? Because the administration is doing this, but unless they hear that there's really going to be an and one of the things that resonates is, loss of jobs in the US. People don't realize LVMH has a very large footprint in the United States. We're unusual in that we have both brands that are in Europe, but we have brands that are based in the United States. And so, unlike many companies, we have, and it's not the difference, some brands have their headquarters is elsewhere and have a manufacturing facility in the United States for that, Toyota as an example. We have homegrown brands, and we have brands that are based here with their global seats in the United States. So, the idea that we have, that what does this affect? It doesn't just affect, it's not just the tariffs, but how does it affect the retail? Right now, retail has been so hurt through COVID. Liquor stores and restaurants are closed because of COVID. You add these tariffs on top of it, what's the effect, to the consumer and to the recovery in this country? So who makes those arguments? Who can be the ones who can talk about that and advocate for you with the on the Hill and with the administration? And really working with your trade associations that are active, but being an active participant to make sure those messages, they need the information, the examples from you. So it's a two-way street in that way.
Right. So yeah, it's very important to participate in the comment period.
Well, we saw, so in the Airbus, just to go back, I mean, the DST, the comment period, the second DST for the 10 countries, the comment period closed in July. I think it was July 15th. But in the Airbus carousel, there were, I think, 24,000 comments. Now, many of them were from restaurants, from restaurants, liquor shops, mom and pop liquor shops. It does not go unnoticed. So, making sure that the voice gets heard is really important, and to participate.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's discuss the European Commission for a minute. They've just appointed their Executive Vice President, Valdis Dombrovskis, to be the new Trade Commissioner, which is subject to approval. Francisco, can you speak to the role of the Trade Commissioner in negotiations between the US and the EU, and what would you say are the priorities for the EU? And then we want to pivot to Peter. He has a specific story he'd like to tell.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Yeah, as you said, Commissioner Dombrovskis has recently been appointed. He's very well considered, a lot of experience in EU matters, and we believe he's going to play a very important role in negotiations and in the relationship with the US, in which we, of course, want to push forward a positive agenda. And we all know that we can succeed in this. The priorities of the Commission as regards trade in general are pushing or strengthening the WTO and in particular the dispute settlement mechanism within it. Of course, the EU is always looking at the diversification of EU trade, and we're looking at putting into place agreements that have been negotiated over the past few months and years. A very important one for us, speaking also from Florida, is Mercosur, and also our agreement with the renewed agreements with Mexico and with Chile, and ongoing negotiations with other very important markets for the EU, such as New Zealand and Australia, for instance. As regards the relationship with the US, of course, the previous negotiations for a transatlantic trade agreement are on hold. They have been for the past 4 years. But there is a mandate to negotiate a reduction of tariffs in industrial goods, and this is one of the main areas in which the EU is focusing with the US, and also phytosanitary measures, discussions about phytosanitary measures. But I believe we can move forward, that we can introduce or develop some agreements, and recent agreement, maybe small as it could be considered, the so-called lobster agreement, is important. It shows that we can do things, and we have to remain to keep in mind that it is the first reduction in tariffs between the EU and the US in over 2 decades. So it has its importance, and I believe we can move forward from that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad that you brought up the reduction in tariffs as the first time. Peter, do you want to speak about lobsters and
Sure,
how that came about? Yeah.
I'm glad Francisco mentioned that. So one comment that you all made was tariffs are not going away. We realized under President Trump, who's called himself the tariff man, that tariffs are an effective tool, political tool, to engage in international relations between countries. Much of the emphasis has been between China and the United States, but we're focused here on the European Union. So I also want to mention the concept when the US imposes extra 25% tariffs or duties on imported products from the European Union issues their own retaliatory tariffs. So for example, lobster. The European added a 25% tariff, which means there's a 20% extra cost for American lobsters to go to Europe. So I teach every year at the Boston Seafood Show. It's the world's largest seafood show every March. And one of the people in the audience came up to me afterward and he said, we have a problem. We're an American company. We import lobsters from Canada. We put them in crates and ship them live to Europe. And the Europeans no longer want our American lobsters. And I said, well, it sounds to me like you're shipping from the United States, but those are Canadian lobsters. So we submitted, as Laura suggested, there are many ways to try and mitigate the results of these onerous penalties. We submitted what's called a ruling request to U.S. Customs and Border Protection. We set forth the facts that the lobsters are caught on a lobster boat that's Canadian flagged. The lobsters returned to a Canadian city, live, transported by truck across the border from Canada to the United States, separated by sizes, and packed for shipment by air to Europe. U.S. Customs wrote back in their ruling that said, we conclude that these are lobsters of Canadian origin. So therefore, when they ship to Europe, they're not subject to that 25%. The client was delighted. The Europeans get to eat lobsters and not have to pay that 25% from on American lobsters, because this is a Canadian lobster that's merely being transported through the United States. So that's an example of the kind of effect that this retaliatory action has had. I want to make two more points that both Lynn and Francisco brought up. Francisco's comment about the olive oil and trade evasion, where you have an extra 25% on olive oil from Spain coming to the United States, suddenly resulting in a 1,000% increase of olive oil from Portugal. That may be legitimate, it may not be. It depends if the olives were substantially changed into olive oil when they were shipped from Portugal to the United States. There is a lot of trade evasion, transshipments. Customs and Border Protection is very aware of it in the United States, is examining more shipments than ever before, seizing more shipments, and issuing penalties and sometimes criminal action against U.S. importers who knowingly try to cheat the system. And Lynn's comment I thought was especially important about the Airbus. So yes, there was an extra customs duty on aircraft made in the European Union. Of course, that's Airbus aircraft when imported to the United States. But what the heck did cherries and Irish whiskey and lemons and olive oil have to do with aircraft? I think that's an important part that I'm glad that Lynn brought up, that the trade associations are lobbying the U.S. representatives and the Trump administration to stop the nonsense. So that was my one story. Thank you.
Yeah. Peter, thank you so much. You really brought up, two very important points. One is the importance for importers to do a country of origin analysis, because as you said, U.S. Customs is heightened to transshipment and falsified declarations at entry. And from products from China, are they from Taiwan or Vietnam? Are they really from China? And then with the EU, if they're on a list. So yes, importers really need to do that country of origin analysis.
Well, Laura, you're probably like me as a fellow customs lawyer. When I go out to lunch or dinner, I'm constantly looking at things and seeing where they're made. And including when I go to the supermarket, is the fish really from Chile? Are the olives from Spain? Are they really? So you and I get into that analysis. Most Americans don't care, but now that the tariffs are in place, it's the front page news, whether you're watching CNN or Fox or reading the Washington Post. What we're talking about today is finally affecting the average American when they go to get their car parts, buy their car, or their computers that they're looking at, even their iPhone.
Right, and the food in their pantry, and
right.
Yeah. So our discussion is trade policy and impacting business, and then it trickles down to the U.S. consumer. Yeah, absolutely. So right, you can't have a discussion. We've been focusing on the EU, but you can't have a discussion on trade disputes without really talking about China. So we're going to discuss China, the big one, the big issue in the room. So as everyone knows, the U.S. has imposed additional tariffs on over 370 billion worth of goods manufactured in China that's imported into the U.S. And again, they're using that as a negotiating tool to address other really important substantive issues, intellectual property protection, technology transfer, and of course, the goal of increasing U.S. manufacturing. The tariffs on Chinese products have been in place since July of 2018, most at 25%, the last list at 7.5%, which went into effect in September of 19. So U.S. importers have been navigating this increased duty burden since September of 18 on a lot of goods. And it's had a tremendous impact on companies of all sizes, and then and frequently passed down to the consumer as well. So Peter, can you talk about what importers are doing to navigate this increased duty liability? And
Sure.
Are they getting refunds from customs?
Will do. So first, we have to understand that China, along with Canada and Mexico, are the largest trading partners with the United States in the number of trillions of dollars. And about 2/3 of all products being produced in China coming to the United States are now subject to that extra 25% customs duties. So it's sort of what Francisco was saying earlier with regard to the olives. It's the same with products that may or may not be made in China. China is a huge country, but a lot of components come from China and are shipped to Taiwan, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, and processed into another product, which are shipped to the United States. Then U.S. Customs has to determine, was that product really made in Vietnam or was it made in China? There's an analysis that customs lawyers like Laura have to undertake in order to properly declare the products coming into the United States. So assuming the product really is from China, there is a process called the exclusion process with the United States Trade Representative's Office, where you can say, even though the product was made in China, there's a shortage of that product in the United States. There's just not enough manufacturing of that same product in the United States. So please, US government, please waive these 25% extra tariffs and allow the products coming from China without paying that extra duty. And that's called the exclusion process. There's a process where you upload information on the USTR website through their portal, and some months after you submit your application, hopefully it's granted. And not only can you get relief from the 25% going forward, but you can then file a protest with US Customs and Border Protection and request, and you will always get, that money's paid to customs on those extra 25% going back to 2018. So in some of our clients, it's millions of dollars. And even for small business, if you're getting $50,000 back, that is also significant. So that's a nice thing that customs has done. Most USTR exclusions are not accepted, but when they are, they're published in the Federal Register. And even if you personally did not file that request, but USTR granted it anyway for another company, if your product is the same as the one that was granted by the USTR, that USTR granting of the removal of the 25% applies to your company as well. So you need to check with your customs lawyer, like Laura, look at the Federal Register notice and apply for a refund with US Customs of that 25% going back all the way to 2018. There are time limits to submit your request to US Customs. If you miss the time limit, you're out of luck. So for those people who have already submitted their request and received their money, congratulations. I expect, whether or not Trump is reelected, that these Section 301 tariffs will not disappear against China or against the steel and aluminum factories around the world. I think they will stay in place. I think there will be some additions and some subtractions of products in the mix of what is coming out of China.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the November election very soon. I don't know how many days it is, but I know it's like on the news. They announced it. It's very, very soon. So we've been discussing the Trump administration policy vis-a-vis the EU and China. Biden recently released his trade policy and discussed the importance of reshoring U.S. manufacturing, its impact on corporate taxes for companies which do in fact move offshore. And so I agree with you, Peter. I think if Biden is elected, I think there will be a difference in tone, perhaps, and perhaps more participation with particularly our European partners. But I don't expect much of a change in the underlying policy, at least not in the near term if Biden is elected. Lynn, can you speak about how your company is preparing, whether we have a second Trump term or whether it's a new Biden administration?
Sure. So we are watching, not surprisingly, we're watching it very closely, trying to read tea leaves like everybody else. And again, we are, I think the best thing to know is, pay attention. I mean, and pay attention on what you think is going to happen. And we are taking out our topics of great interest, some of our policy matters, and say, what is it going to look like under a Trump? Potentially, what does it look like under Trump 2? Does it continue the way it is? Is it ramped up? It's hard. I mean, they're ramping, what's going to happen? Where we're looking at it is, because so much is caught up in the political process right now, as we are seeing every day and with hearings, we're trying to even see, what are we seeing between now and the election? Because there are some, effectively strange bedfellows that are now sort of coming together in this trade area. So, again, engaging with our trade associations, participating, and then writing, really paying attention and writing some briefing notes, because my view is that, what we can do is try to tell the business people what is going to be happening, from a policy point of view, but what that then translates into their business. And the other piece, which I think has to go not unspoken, is that I don't think it's going to be, regardless of what the outcome is, I think we are potentially, you have to look at the broader political context, because we could have a lot of uncertainty in the outcome for a while. And how does that affect trade? And how does that affect things that are going into effect in January, if things are in this, if there's an uncertain time, which we don't really yet know. So, paying attention and highlighting all of these for our business executives, who it doesn't help them to know that necessarily they'll be working in an uncertain environment, but I think they'd rather know it today than to wake up and then say, oh, why didn't you tell me?
Right, to wake up in January and it still not be clear. Yeah.
Well, that could be, but I mean, but at least they should know up front that could be the case, as opposed to, post-election thinking it's going to just, we're going to know and say, okay, if it's Biden, this will be the outcome. We may be in a real gray area for a while.
Right.
And how do you adjust from a business point of view?
Yeah. Well, let me just add, from an historical perspective, we are all international consumers, from the headphones that Laura's wearing to the glasses that I'm wearing to the chair probably made behind Lynn and the headphones that Francisco's wearing. They're all made overseas. The things we eat are made overseas. The computers you're looking at, or iPhone or whatever, iPad you're looking at right now, is made overseas. We're all in an interconnected world. That's not going to change. Even under Trump, what he's tried to do with China, it's only changed marginally. So we're still going to be in an international world. Setting up barriers to trade is dangerous. As we all know and learned in school, that's what led to the Great Depression. So I'm looking forward to drinking Irish whiskey with Lynn and my other panelists, because I think that's just good for everybody. So, in the same with any other international product, we at the United States are great sellers of American-made products as well. I don't know if we talk about that as much. We talk about import, but we also export quite a bit, Boeing being one of the biggest examples.
I would just add to your comment, Peter, with Spanish olives.
Right. We all need Spanish olives.
If we're having cocktails, we have to.
By the way, when I mentioned the olive oil, I didn't mean there was anything wrong with Portuguese exports to the U.S. Increasing at all, or that there was anything illicit in that. It is only an example of tariffs affecting trade and U.S. importers looking for alternative supplies that fit them better in that precise moment. But I was trying to highlight an effect, not implying anything wrong with that. I'm actually glad that if it's not Spanish olive oil, why not Portuguese, of course?
But I agree, but I think the bigger point is one of the focuses of the Trump administration is try to somehow bring back to the United States manufacturing. It hasn't worked. Olive oil is a good example. We don't make olive oil in the United States. We're going to import it from somewhere, whether it's Spain or Portugal or some other country. It's the same with iPhones. We don't make iPhones in the United States, whether they're made in China or Vietnam or Thailand or Taiwan. That's the way it's going to be. I don't think getting manufacturing back to the United States to make sneakers is the way the process has worked or will work.
I agree with you, but I do know there's olive oil made in California. So as having been a purchaser of the California olive oil on a regular basis. So.
Right.
The same like pineapples, so you name it. You know, do we make coffee? We don't make coffee. We have to import coffee. So are we going to import it from Brazil, from Chile, from Colombia? We have to import it from somewhere. So it's a shell game of where we're going to assess these tariff duties, punish one country and reward another country. I mean, that's what the WTO is supposed to be. So we all get together and we all agree what the trading rules are. For the first time in and I've been doing this 30 years, there's a lot of uncertainty, or what Lynn called the gray area now when it comes to international trading rules.
Yeah, I mean, and in a specific example, when we were talking about, you know, during the pandemic, and I would like to discuss the pandemic, is that, a ventilator I read has like 800 parts. So there's lots of talk that we should be manufacturing ventilators in this country, but that means all 800 parts? Like that, to me, that's a very, you know, open, difficult question. So as really, you know, as a backdrop to our discussion of trade disputes is the ongoing COVID pandemic. Francisco, can you speak a bit about the effect on trade between the EU and US because of the pandemic?
Yeah, well, the trade has been affected globally. Figures, international trade flows have dropped dramatically over March, April, and May. They increased a little bit later on, and trying to pick up since. For instance, Spanish exports to the world dropped from January to June around 15%, and the figures are very similar when we talked about the US. So it has had an effect, and I believe it is going to have a long-term effect as regards the way companies design their supply chains, for instance. If we talk specifically about COVID and about health products, we have seen over the worst part of the pandemic, we have seen some restrictions here and there in the US and in the EU of PPE exports and maybe not prohibitions, but maybe licenses, and they have been watched very closely, and countries are getting ready to be able to produce part of that. I don't believe personally, I don't believe that self-sufficiency is the answer for this. I believe always, as Peter, trade is the answer for our trouble. But to a certain extent, besides managing stock of PPEs, for instance, countries are looking at maybe having some safeguard production of some products. But I believe trade is the answer, and I believe we have learned how to deal with it. But in a more general framework, I believe that what companies are doing, and we see that in Spanish companies and in their US clients, they're moving from offshoring and maybe from longer and perhaps more cost-efficient supply chains to nearshoring and from to more resilient supply chains. And that, I believe, is going to be a long-lasting effect of the pandemic. And companies are looking at that very, very closely.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the changes to supply chain will be with us for quite a while. Lynn, can you speak about the changes in your supply chain, specifically regarding PPE? I certainly didn't know before March of this year. I think most people now it's probably the most common acronym. And I'm particularly interested in the whiskey to sanitizer change.
Okay, so it was really just more of a, so during the height of the pandemic, our perfumes and cosmetics and so instead of making perfume, they changed to make hand sanitizer in France, and they made a lot. And people, I mean, and that it provided a huge number. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. And then in the United States, our whiskey, so we have a whiskey company called Woodinville Whiskey up in Washington State, and it converted and made hand sanitizer. Which does not smell like whiskey, as I said. It actually smells a lot just like pure alcohol. So what we've done is, this was sort of temporary moves. We took our apparel, some of our apparel lines were made into making gowns and other, it was actually quite interesting to watch we actually have manufacturing in the United States. For Louis Vuitton, and they had to get all these approvals, but they made gowns, and they, during the height of the pandemic, and to get those approvals on an expedited basis. But it was our way of helping support the community, and also, at a time of great need.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, we're coming close on our time, but I want Peter, can you speak about PPE and the export restrictions?
Sure. Well, so every country in the world, including the European Union as a group of countries, created a rule which would not allow the export of PPE, whether it's gowns, face shields, masks, etc., sanitizers, from that location, with very few exceptions. So in the United States, we have FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Association, and they issued a regulation that prohibited the export of any of these PPE from the United States, with very few exceptions. You're sending it to the Department of Defense, military people around the world, some international organizations, so think of the International Red Cross, and there are a few other examples. But for the most part, if it's in the United States, whether it's made here or not, once it's here, it can't be exported. I didn't think that was a good idea. I was not pleased with the Trump administration doing that, or with the other countries of the world doing that. But capitalism still works. There was a great need, and still is, for PPE. So what happened? If you look around at your office, or the mask that you probably have right near you, chances are it was made in China. So the supply chain did change the way Lynn described. I have a client, a US company, was buying their glasses, their lenses, from their Chinese supplier. Once this pandemic came along, the US entrepreneur was very smart and contacted the supplier and said, hey, can you make the same plastic face shields that are plastic face shields instead of lenses? And they said, certainly. So that company the US company ended up contracting with FEMA and supplying Chinese-made face shields to FEMA, which distributed in the United States. That's an example of how the international supply chain worked to our advantage. We shouldn't close borders, we should open borders. If the Chinese didn't send us the PPE, we would be in trouble. And because I in that business, I ended up on the side. I ended up talking to people, including FedEx, and they were fighting to get slots at the airports in Shanghai. There was so much PPE being shipped from China through the Shanghai airport that it was difficult to get the planes to take off fast enough. So I used that information to buy some FedEx stock. Why not? So I made some money out of this deal. But PPE is not going away. Trade, hopefully, is not going away, no matter what borders or barriers are being created under the Trump administration and maybe under the Biden administration. Fortunately, the supply chain internationally did work to benefit all of us.
Yeah, Thank you so much. I'm going to give the last word to Francisco to speak about, since you're sitting in Florida, trade going into Florida is so important for Latin America. Any final comments on the pandemic, trade? You mentioned Mercosur earlier.
Well, I want to highlight that Florida is an important hub for Spanish business in the U.S. and in Latin America. There are a great number of Spanish companies establishing themselves in Miami for doing business with the U.S. and with Latin America. And we also see a lot of Latin American companies come to Miami because they want to do business with the U.S. and with Europe. And we want them to do that business with Europe through Spain, using Spain as a business platform, as their gateway to the European Union. So this is a tremendous business environment for our companies, and it really has a Latin American flavor that we try to use to our advantage. And Florida ranks very high about the main exporters of products from the U.S. to Spain, and it is also very high among the main importers. So Florida is a great trading partner for us and for the European Union.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to Peter and Lynn and Francisco. Thank you again. Thank you to the Chamber for hosting this discussion on trade policy and the trade disputes between the EU and the US. And now, Christina, thank you. Thank you for hosting us.
Thank you very much, Laura, Lynn, Francisco, Peter, for accepting our invitation and for what I thought was a very engaging discussion and some really interesting insights into the practical effects of those trade disputes on companies, whether small or large, and on consumers, because we sometimes forget about them when we discuss those issues. I was also very pleased that we were able to offer our audience the scoop on the lobster story, not to mention insights into Spanish and Portuguese olives and Scotch whiskey. I think, many consumers here enjoy those. So it was good to know how it actually works in practice and why prices go up. Having said that, I also wanted to remind everybody that the opinions expressed are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of the EACC. Having said that, this is what the EACC is all about. We create business opportunities by providing strategic, relevant, and timely information and expert insights, and by connecting you to experts and high-level professionals across our extensive transatlantic network. So if you're not a member yet, join us now, because we're Europeans and Americans connect to do business. Again, I wanted to thank our audience for participating, for the speakers, for providing us with a very engaging discussion today on transatlantic trade and the impact on products. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.